you help us out? Amazing. All right, a big round of applause, please, for Emma Britnor.
Hello. Cool. Hello, everyone. This is what I'm about to talk to you about. Disclaimer, I love Storybook. This whole talk is centered around its greatness. But I promise you I'm not being paid for any of this, so it's not an ad. I just really love it. So to start off with, I'm Emma. My pronouns are she, her. And I've worked as a software engineer for the past 6 years. Most recently working at Bloomberg, where I've been for just over a year. I started off in the front-end space, but now I work more across the full stack on a team that's building out tools for evaluators to evaluate the prices of bonds. This is actually my 5th time coming to All Day Hey. I love this conference, so thank you so much for having me. And I'm super excited to talk to you all today. So to kick it off, I love all things front-end and the web, and making people realize the exciting tools that we have in the web to be able to build so rapidly. But honestly, my love for front-end really stemmed from my love for art as a child. When I was younger, I didn't even know this job existed, but I did know that I had 2 loves, and that was art and computers. That led me down a pretty untraditional path to where I am today, but I actually studied here in the heart of Leeds, and I also started my career here at a small digital agency called Mixed. Since then, I've worked at a few places, Starling Bank, feeling very outnumbered by the amount of Monzo people here today, Twitter, now of course known as X, if that's what you're into, and most recently Bloomberg, as I said. My love for Storybook was really born at Starling, but it flourished at Twitter. At Twitter, I worked building out features for search features on the Twitter web app, and then I later moved into a team that was building out reusable web product components like the tweet, and also maintaining the internal UI library. I was in this unique position when I moved teams, where I'd spent time building out features in a very complex, large web app, and then I moved to a team where we were building in complete isolation for components that were consumed in that large web app. And it got me thinking. I realized that there were huge benefits to Storybook for accelerating the development process, and I felt like we could use it better outside of just your component library use case for those larger applications. So throughout my career, I've worked on some large apps, and in my opinion, they all start facing the same problem once the number of engineers working on a singular app grows, or the number of apps grow. Engineers make changes, and they don't understand the repercussions of those changes because they don't understand how the components are used or where, and that leads to causing bugs. It becomes increasingly difficult to keep on top of all of the components in those applications as they scale. And when new features are being built, it ends up leading to a lot of duplicate work instead of just actually reusing existing components, either because discovery is hard or because components have been built in such a specific way to that use case that pulling them out to refactor and make more flexible is actually more work than just building from scratch, which can then lead to bloated code bases, which you don't want in an already large application. So component-driven development really allows us to decouple that development process. Large files are split into smaller, reusable parts, which then means teams can work on things without being reliant on each other. And since the components can then be reused, it speeds up that development process. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably like, Emma, have you ever heard of React? Which, yes, component-driven development is a fundamental feature of front-end libraries like React. But in reality, we still end up with these huge files of components that are crossing multiple concerns that really should be split out further, components that are too specific, that really need to be made more flexible. It just feels like there's more work to be done outside of the component libraries to really feel the benefit of modularized, reusable code. So let's first remind ourselves of some of the best practices when thinking about component API design that we should consider when both building in isolation and as part of those large web applications. So first, remember to keep your components small and focused. A good rule to follow is try to create components that have a single responsibility. It makes them more reusable and maintainable and easier to debug when things go wrong. Encourage component composition. What I mean by that is break down those larger complex UIs into smaller reusable subcomponents and then construct those smaller components into larger reusable ones. This approach promotes modularity and reusability while maintaining that clear and concise component hierarchy. Pass all your data to UI components via the props. Personally, I like to have a split of kind of like container components than your UI components. So the container handles all of the data fetching and any business logic and literally just passes through the finalized data straight to your UI component. Keep your naming as generic as it makes sense. There are benefits to having your component named more generic, because you don't, especially when you don't know all the specific use cases at the time of it being built. So for example, if you're building a new component and calling it profile header, could it really just be a header? Like, is it really tied to the profile, or is that just the first case of where you're building it that it is on a profile? Other engineers are more likely to take a look and use that if the naming is more generic. Set default props for your optional props. This makes your components more predictable, especially to other engineers who don't know kind of how the component is working under the hood. This one is kind of the most important, in my opinion, is localizing the styles for your components. It helps with debugging CSS issues. All styles related to a component should really be housed where that component lives. Styles relating to a child component should never be in the parent container, unless that parent container is controlling something like the layout, for example, like a grid. And finally, utilize render props for a slots-based API for increased flexibility, so that your consumers can really customize sections or slots of your component whilst the rest of it remains intact. This is especially useful if your company does a lot of experimentation with testing out different UIs. Follow all of those best practices and you'll have stunning components that are maintainable, modular, flexible, and reusable. And what better place to house those components than Storybook? We typically associate Storybook as a great tool for building out component libraries, but there are so many benefits to it I'm going to cover in the next few minutes for development in those larger applications as well, and teams that have multiple applications. Storybook enables us to build UIs in complete isolation. You can create and showcase these components in an environment outside of your main application, which looks like this. And this is great for getting sign-off if you need sign-off on new UIs without actually having to make any changes to your application. It is important to note that you can integrate Storybook with React, Vue.js, Svelte, Next.js, and some others. I'm going to cover some React examples today. So how can you get started with Storybook? You run these two commands, and the world is your oyster. It installs required dependencies, sets up scripts to run and start Storybook, provides some default config, and even gives you some boilerplate stories to get you started. So once you have that, you can really start writing some stories. So I'm going to take you through that. Here, I just have some code for a basic button component. Just to go over it, we have some style component stuff on the left, which isn't really relevant, but on the right-hand side is our scaffolding of the button. We have some props with default set, and where you can see on the top line, label is the only required property, and then we have some comments describing some of the properties, and then that's all passed through to our style button. Cool, so now that we have our component, we can get started with writing some stories. So these sit in a stories file alongside the component. First, we have to define some metadata for the story. So title is where you want that story to sit in the generated Storybook. So here it's in a folder called components and then button. Component is that button component that I just mentioned, and you can see I'm importing it from the file that I just showed. Tags, there are a bunch of Storybook tags. This one specifically means Storybook, please auto-generate us some documentation. That would be great, thank you very much. And then you have to remember to export the meta as default in your stories file. Once you have this, you can then just start writing stories. So this is what the stories look like. The name that you put here is what then gets put into the generated Storybook as well. So you can see we have the default component. So that's basically what a user can expect if they don't define any of the optional properties. We're only just passing through the label. Secondary overrides the kind property. Large overrides the size. And disabled overrides the state of disabled. You can see from these stories that it really helps to prevent code and design inconsistencies from developing when building software products at scale. Because we're providing almost like a rule book as to how these components are expected to act and be used. Designers can even use these storybooks to then create new UIs from that. The stories we wrote previously, this is the auto-generated documentation that you get. You can see at the top we have prop documentation with the defaults listed as well. And then the comments that we had in the code is also populated there. Shows you all of the versions that you have written, and it even provides code snippets which engineers can just copy and paste into their consuming app and use your component. So you see that, we got free documentation, which I feel like is always a win. You get better discoverability of components and increased knowledge sharing, meaning in the end, less duplicate work, hopefully. I know you're probably sitting there thinking, this is cool, Emma, but large web app components are much more complex than that. We have sometimes API calls or changing of global state. And don't worry, I got you there as well, because it doesn't matter if your component makes API calls. You can mock these in your stories too by utilizing parameters. So in the setup that we showed before, there's this parameters that you can send through, and they're a set of static name metadata about a story. Here we're setting the MSW handler. MSW is an API mocking library, for those of you who don't know, and we are intercepting all of the API calls that this component is making to /API/something, and we're making it return our fake data for the story's purposes. The cool thing about this is you can override parameters on a story basis. So if you want to show what your component looks like when it receives an error from an API, you can do that as well in one of your stories, which is pretty incredible. In addition to that, if your component is interacting with a global state, you can also replicate this in your stories using a decorator. So decorators are a way to wrap a story in some extra rendering functionality. So here it kind of provides it some more context. We're wrapping it in a provider with a mock store, and we pass through some mock state. This means any changes to the story, any changes to state within the rendered story is actually interacting with actual state, like your actual component does in the real world, instead of mocking anything. And you can even code these interactions into your stories as well, using the play method. So looping back to the button example that we had before, this one is just finding the button, and then it's using user event from Storybook and clicking on that button. Interaction stories can really be useful for components whose UI changes based off a user interaction. So from those few extra tools, you really can build whole entire UIs without a need for a complex dev stack and parallelize development within a team, which makes things much quicker. And honestly, in my opinion, the best part of it all is that you can import those stories and test them directly using React Testing Library for UI-driven testing. So here we're importing all of the stories that I just showed. We're also importing composed stories from Storybook. We're passing through our stories to that function and then extracting each of the stories, and then we can render those directly. So you can see I'm rendering the default one, and I'm rendering the disabled one on line 10 and 17. And then I'm just writing all my normal React Testing Library code. I don't need to do any of the setup. All of the cases are taken care for me from the stories that we had written. So the test coverage provided by Storybook is really good. It supports many different kinds of tests. You've got visual tests, accessibility, interaction, and snapshot tests, which really makes it a game changer compared to any other tool. So now that you have your components managed via Storybook, identifying duplicate efforts is much easier, especially across multiple applications. So you might realize that you can actually support cross-project integration by maybe creating your own shared library internally. You can easily drag and drop your now well-documented, reusable, and tested components because you've done 90% of the heavy lifting to get you there. As a bonus, Storybook has some really cool add-ons, which I didn't have time to go through today, but I wanted to mention their plugins that are both core and community-driven, these three specifically. Also, the integration with Next.js is really cool. You can compose and test whole pages together. So to sign off, Storybook is a powerful tool for building complex applications. I hope you give it a try and see for yourself, and I promise it's still not an ad. I just love it. Thank you very much. I didn't have time for a recap slide, but if anything wasn't clear or you have any questions, these are my contacts. I do have my Twitter there. I don't really use it that much anymore for obvious reasons. But please connect with me on LinkedIn or email me. Thank you.